TV critic for Broadcasting and Cable and TVWorthWatching.com, sitting in for Terry Gross. Our first guest today, Charles Ardai, is both an author and a publisher. His recent mystery novel, Songs of Innocence, written under the pen name Richard Alias, spelled A-L-E-A-S, just won a Shamus Award as Best Paperback Original. Charles Ardai published that novel, and many others, under his personal imprint Hard Case Crimes, printing not only his books, but new books by other authors and re-releases of obscure novels by classic writers. Mickey Spillane, Ed McBain, Lawrence Block, all and more are featured in the Hard Case Crimes lineup, and all books are published the way pulp mystery novels used to be, in paperback with lurid covers of sexy women and tough-looking gumshoes. Charles Ardai founded Hard Case Crime after selling his internet company, Juno, in 2001. Next month, Hard Case Crime will publish its 50th book, Ardai's 50 to 1. Terry spoke to Charles Ardai, a.k.a. Richard Alias, earlier this year, after his novel Songs of Innocence was published.
Charles Ardai, welcome to Fresh Air. I'd like to start with a reading from Songs of Innocence, but would you set it up for us first?
Absolutely. Songs of Innocence is the sequel to a book called Little Girl Lost about a private investigator named John Blake, and at the end of that book he quits his job and goes back to school because of a terrible crisis he goes through in the first book. In the second book, he never intends to go back into investigation until a friend of his, Dory Burke, is found apparently having killed herself. It was an apparent suicide, and he's so distraught because of this that he takes it on himself to investigate and find out what happened, because he doesn't believe it was suicide. He thinks it was murdered. She hadn't killed herself, not because she wouldn't have. She'd talked about suicide plenty. We both had. It's what unhappy people who were ashamed of their past and not too sure about their future did. I wasn't proud of it, neither was she, but you know what? Better to talk about it than to do it. And that was the promise we'd made each other. If one of us ever felt like doing it, seriously felt that way, we'd call the other and talk it out instead. I'd never gotten to that point myself, but she had more than once, and she'd called me every time. But not this time. And she would have. She would have. Then there was the other half of the deal. She promised me she'd call me first, and in return I promised her that if I was ever unable to talk her out of it, and she ever went ahead and killed herself, I promised I'd come there and clean the place out, get rid of any trace of her professional life, so her mother would never have to know, and her father too, for that matter. Neither of them would have to read in their paper that their little girl had paid her rent by performing sexual services for $180 an hour plus tips. No, not that. Just that she was dead, which God knows would be so much easier to take.
And that's my guest, Charles Ardai, who writes under the pen name Richard Alias from his latest book, Songs of Innocence, which is published on his press, Hard Case Crime. The idea of suicide is the center of the reading that you just did, and it's a constant through the book. Why did you want suicide to kind of hang over the whole book?
John Blake is an atypical character as the lead in a hard-boiled detective story because he's not 6'2", he's not an ex-Marine. He's very much the opposite. He's a small, slender, intellectual fellow with glasses. And for him to have gone through the traumatic events of the first book, Little Girl Lost, would have scarred him. And before I sat down to write Songs of Innocence, I was trying to decide what the second chapter in his life might be like. And the obvious answer was that somebody of his emotional makeup would be scarred. And it seemed more interesting to me to begin with him on a precipice and see if I could push him over the edge than to have him shrug off some pretty grim events in the earlier book.
And he just keeps being in more and more pain. He starts out with a broken rib that's bandaged from the previous book. and so he starts out with a bandaged, chest and the broken rib, and then he just keeps getting into more. Keeps getting more and more physically and emotionally wounded as the book goes on. And these aren't wounds that he can kind of brush off. He's not tough inside. He's very vulnerable. Why did you want to make your main character as vulnerable as he is?
If you look at the hard-boiled novels dating back to the pulp era, they really fall into two categories. There are the angry ones, which are sort of wish-fulfillment novels, Mike Hammer stories of a super tough fellow who punches out the bad guys. And then there are the sad ones, and I find those more interesting, more compelling. The person who is walking wounded, the person who is facing a bad outcome and knows it and fights against it just because that's what you have to do. That's what it means to be human. Cornell Woolrich, who was one of the most troubled writers of the period, he wrote Rear Window, for which he's best known, but also dozens of other books, all of them very bleak, and he led a very bleak life himself, described noir at one point, the field in which he wrote, with an image that he had remembered seeing as a child. He said it's like being an insect under an overturned glass, and it tries to climb up the side, and it can't, and it can't, and it can't. And that's the story of Thomas Hardy's characters. It's the story of Greek tragedy, and it's the story of modern noir fiction. It's what I find most appealing and most interesting about the crime fiction field.
And you studied literature in college at Columbia. What did you study?
Well, I was a specialist in British Romantic poetry, which you can imagine made my mother very happy because she saw all sorts of employment possibilities.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
This was Wordsworth, Shelley, Blake, Coleridge, and when I decided to create a detective character, it was almost inevitable that in a field that had detectives named Spencer and Marlowe, I would have to pick one of my favorite poets. So he's John Blake, which I guess is really two of my favorite poets because John is from Keats. And Songs of Innocence derives a lot of its the chapter opening quotations and so forth from Blake. Whether that really influences the kind of writing I do, I don't know. I certainly don't write in the style of the Romantics, except in one sense, which is that the Romantics were responding to an earlier period of poetry where the language was very elevated, and it was not the language of what Wordsworth said, a man speaking to men. The same thing was true in mystery fiction. In the 30s, the golden age of mystery fiction, you had people like Dorothy Sayers, who wrote about murder in terms of poison in the tea and death in the vicarage. And it wasn't really the world of violence as people knew it. After World War II, you saw the sudden explosion of the hard-boiled movement, which was people talking in the vernacular and scenes of violence the way they were actually experienced. You had Chandler and Hammond and so on.